Well, we're back. Again, I genuinely not know what to do. 1 second. Definitely testing my patience. One moment. Oh, and also, Kitty, welcome. Thank you so much for passing by. Obviously, a little bit distracted. Okay. Well, if it disconnects again, uh, double check something. My concern is that I think it disconnects like for like 2 minutes, and that's like longer than like the Twitch. Basically, like it's gonna like separate the VODs into like 5-minute chunks. And I don't know that I want that to happen. Like I think the disconnect is like just long enough that it'll cut the stream. Not to mention, definitely not good for viewership to cut out every 10 minutes. Yeah, I mean, yeah, so far for this stream, yeah, it's been cut up 3 times. But like if it cuts out again, I'm probably gonna have to like cancel the stream, unfortunately, which I definitely don't want to do. And it seems like JohnnyScarlett might want to, I think, reschedule. They'll kind of be to be confirmed. So it might work out. Oh, and Freedom Dow, welcome. Thank you so much for passing by. I hope you've been doing well. I'm gonna check some of my settings. Yeah, definitely not a bitrate issue. That before. All right, we're gonna give it one more college try. Super apologize for that. Okay, so where was I? Covering this story about a skin patch for peanut allergy. So, Alkis Gaius, I guess, chief of the Allergy, Asthma, and Airway Biology branch within a division of the National Institutes of Health, said in an editorial accompanying the study that it was important to consider the pros and cons of treatments, such as the skin patch versus oral peanut immunotherapy, which involves consuming small amounts of peanuts to reduce the severity of the allergy. Tagayas, who was not involved in the study, noted that a separate trial of oral immunotherapy appeared to have been more successful at protecting against allergic reactions, but cautioned that it was difficult to compare two separate studies. Yeah, I've now started streaming for the third time. Still, he said the peanut patch trial was very good news for toddlers and their families as the next step toward a future with more treatments for food allergies. And this appears to have been in development for a while. Where, I mean, I remember reading about kind of like exposure therapy or like exposure therapy for allergies, peanut allergies, going back like 10, 15 years. I'm definitely not an expert on the research. But it seems like, in the beginning, if I remember correctly, they like pretty promising. But even then, it didn't seem like the promise held out over the long term. Or they had to like go back and revisit like how to do it better. And it seems like the furthest they have come. Well, this is phase 3, so this is an actual therapy that appears to be in development. We're just going to go through the abstract since that's all I have access to. So, no approved treatment for peanut allergy exists for children younger than 4 years of age, and the efficacy and safety of epicutaneous immunotherapy with a peanut patch in toddlers with peanut allergy are unknown. And I think, if I remember correctly, just me thinking out loud, I think at one point there was like a school of thought, again, just like going by my memory, which might be flawed, that in order to, since there was like this increasing rise of allergies, in particular peanut allergies, and I think at one point there was like a school of thought of like pretty much delay exposure to peanuts like for as long as possible, or basically until like they're past the age of like 4 or 5, or like the longer that you can delay exposure to peanuts or other allergens, the thought is that you might potentially decrease the chances of becoming allergic. As opposed to this, it seems like kind of like an opposite approach of early exposure therapy. But again, I'm just going off of my memory. So, what do they do? This is phase 3. This is a multi-center, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial involving children 1 to 3 years of age, with peanut allergy confirmed by a double-blind, placebo-controlled food challenge. So they confirmed that they actually had a peanut allergy. So, and it seems like, essentially, speculating that these children that are very young, 1 to 3 years of age, they are essentially like born with a peanut allergy, or like I imagine that they have been born with this allergy. And they're confirming that they actually have it. It's hard for me to imagine, but anything's possible. But it's hard for me to imagine that, ever a 1 or 1.5 year old has somehow developed an allergy in like literally the first year of life. Patients who had an eliciting dose, the dose necessary to elicit an allergic reaction, of 300 milligrams or less of peanut protein were assigned in a 2-to-1 ratio to receive epicutaneous immunotherapy delivered by means of a peanut patch intervention group, or to receive placebo administered daily for 12 months. The primary endpoint was a treatment response as measured by the eliciting dose of peanut protein at 12 months. Safety was assessed according to the occurrence of adverse events during the use of the peanut patch or placebo. So the results of the 362 patients who underwent randomization, I would say this is a pretty decently large sample size, given that they're limited to very young babies or toddlers essentially. So about 85% completed the trial. Primary efficacy endpoint result was observed in roughly 2/3 of children intervention group, as compared with 1/3 of those in the placebo group. Actually interesting. I'm going to read the primary efficacy. So it seems like 1/3. If I'm understanding this correctly, it seems like, it was effective in the placebo group for like 1/3 of them. As in, like, whatever their primary endpoint was. Yeah, and the endpoint was a treatment response, as measured by the eliciting dose of peanut protein at 12 months. So it seems like the placebo group had, pretty much a fairly high response rate. As in, it seems like in the placebo group, 1/3 responded. Like, reduced allergy. which is actually pretty surprising. Adverse events that occurred during the use of the intervention or placebo, irrespective of relatedness, were observed in 100% of the patients in intervention group and 99.2% in the placebo group. Okay, pretty much like virtually everyone had an adverse event. Serious adverse events occurred in 8.6% of the patients in the intervention group and 2.5% of those in the placebo group, which, yeah, makes sense. Anaphylaxis occurred in 7.3% versus 3.4%, respectively. Serious treatment-related adverse events occurred in 0.4% of patients in the intervention group and none in the placebo group. Treatment-related anaphylaxis occurred in 1.6%. Yeah, that also makes sense. But still, this high of a response rate. Pretty unexpected. I would not have thought. I've definitely come across placebo response rates high in many studies, especially studies related to my own condition, for sure. But with one where you're actually like you're either testing for allergies, and you're trying to reduce an allergic response, like presumably with the placebo group, like you're challenging them with nothing, and this might just be due to natural growth and development of whatever, the toddlers or the babies. They track them over 12 months. So it seems like, obviously it's probably, placebo is likely not doing anything, I would imagine. But rather just as maybe some of these babies or toddlers grow and develop over the 12 months, like their allergy appears to decrease or lessen. But yeah, basically have double the response rate in comparison to the placebo group. Okay, so since I think it's pretty much, as far as I can tell, officially rescheduling the chat that I had with JohnnyScarlett, I'm going to cover the rest of the content that I had planned. And I think this is a perfect transition to this study, which is pretty much about the placebo effect or expectations, and how it intersects with the placebo effect, where in that in this peanut allergy study that I just went through, that appeared to have a pretty high response rate in the placebo group, about 1/3 of them, and the placebo effect appears to be pretty powerful. As I mentioned before, I've definitely come across high response rates in placebo groups before, where like even studies with that involve my disease or treatments for my disease, like you actually do pretty frequently come across high response rates in like the 30 to 40%, where it's like, yeah, these patients are pretty much getting no treatment, and yet you are still observing an improvement, and this improvement is appears to be at a physiological level, where it's like biomarkers are improving, things that are, it's not that they are subjectively feeling better, but by some objective measures, they appear to be improving. And as I mentioned before, it's Mental Health Awareness Month for the month of May. And so for each stream that I'm able to have and not be disconnected from, I'm going to try to cover at least one study in the category or vein of mental health. I think this falls in that category and perfectly overlaps with what I just went through in the placebo response rates. 1 second. Okay, so this study, which I think was published fairly recently in the past couple years, or last year, to be specific, where placebo-induced expectations of mood enhancement generate a positivity effect in emotional processing. So, while there is a large body of research addressing the impact of expectation on pain perception, far less is known about the nature of expectation effects on mood states and emotional processing. Up to 70 to 80% of the benefits of antidepressant treatments have been attributed to placebo responses, indicating the urgency of minimizing placebo responses in clinical trials but maximizing these responses in clinical practice. And like, potentially, the placebo effect, if you can actually harness it properly, and we have like perfect understanding of it and how to induce it, is almost arguably like one of the perfect treatments, as in like you are getting a benefit with virtually, could be ideally no side effects, or like I can't imagine what side effects there would be of a placebo effect, but I'm sure there's some possibilities. And so it's like, while people view the placebo effect as a bad thing, it potentially can be a good thing if harnessed, if you actually just like know how to induce the placebo effect properly. Where again, if we had a perfect understanding, and we knew the type of people, or if we're able to screen people, who would be responsive to the placebo effect, and how to actually induce it, that would be like a powerful thing, and probably even a more optimal thing. A so-called negativity bias in attention, that is, increased attention towards negative information and decreased attention towards positive information, is a key feature in clinical depression and a critical modulator in the maintenance and prognosis of depressive symptoms. This overlaps and correlates, the personality trait of neuroticism, where, pretty much a very strong association and correlation between the higher that you score in neuroticism, the greater your risk for depression. For instance, compared to healthy adults, individuals in a negative mood state are often slower at identifying positive emotions, focus more strongly on sad facial expressions, are more sensitive to negative facial expressions, and interpret neutral facial expressions more often as negative. Antidepressant treatment has been shown to decrease such a bias, but the role of expectation in this improvement is unknown. Promising findings in previous studies indicate that placebo effects in emotional processing activate top-down regulation on the downstream processing of sensory input. Such a regulatory process is also thought to be involved in the generation of a positivity effect, that is, an enhanced processing, positive compared to negative information, which in turn has been associated with a better mood state. Thus, one could speculate that expectation alone can activate a preferential processing of specific emotional information that may promote mood enhancement. In the context of placebo analgesia, essentially pain control or pain management, it has been shown that the induction of treatment expectation is more effective when combining false information about treatment efficacy with an active manipulation than just informing participants verbally. Such an active manipulation through conditioning and learning procedures is well established for testing placebo analgesia. It seems to be more complicated to apply in the affective system. The few existing studies simulating antidepressant or mood-enhancing effects within an experimental setup suggest that placebo effects in the affective domain may similarly depend on such learning effects. So, in the current study, we aimed to investigate whether the induction of positive expectation can generate a positivity effect in healthy individuals. So this, it sounds like they want to do, what I guess might be called some priming. As in, like, there are some people that have a negativity bias, maybe and induce the opposite, or a positivity bias, or a positive expectation. Specifically, within a controlled crossover design, positive expectation was induced by combining an alleged intranasal placebo oxytocin treatment with an active, hidden manipulation of a training set that facilitated the detection of positive stimuli. After placebo induction or control condition, participants performed an emotion classification task in which morphed faces with varying degrees of fearful or happy facial expressions had to be classified. We hypothesized that placebo expectation would increase participants' tendency to classify even subtle expressions as being happy, while fearful expressions become less salient. We expected that such an induced positivity effect would be directly related to reported treatment expectations and mood changes. By regressing classification accuracies of the placebo on the control conditions, we were able to generate emotion-specific psychometric response functions that allowed us to disentangle expectation effects on response tendency and discrimination ability slope. The latter is particularly interesting given controversial evidence about whether expectation can actually improve cognitive functions. So it's like, yeah, super interesting, where, yeah, they're trying to basically harness a placebo effect, but in positive direction, or a positive expectation, or positive affect, as opposed to negative affect. And this is not to, and I also want to be careful in the sense that, yeah, I don't want to simplify it or get the message across that it all comes down to like belief, and that you can just kind of like believe yourself out of negative thoughts, or depression, or any sort of psychological state, where, you know, as much as, you know, I have a lot of research on optimism, and the, you know, overall positive effects of optimistic, and, you know, doing things with a positive affect. I know that whatever, putting that into a prescription is not overly helpful. As in, like, even though optimism on the whole appears to be beneficial, you can't just say to someone to be optimistic, or like if they have that negativity bias, just say to stop the negativity bias, because that negativity bias exists for a reason, and there are likely complicated reasons for that. All that to say that, you know, easier said than done, basically. So, before we go through their results, I want to get into their methodology. So, they recruited 44 young adults for this study, and obviously they screened them, so no prescribed medication, no history of psychiatric or neurological disorders, and normal or corrected to normal vision. Participants were recruited online advertisement. They received financial compensation, 50 euros. Participants gave informed consent, and ethical approval was granted. Yes. Registered. So, after successful screening, participants attended the lab on 2 days, separated by approximately 1 week. Both testing days involved identical procedures, with the exception of the expectation induction, which is described in detail below. On each day, participants sat in a comfortable chair with their eyes positioned 100 centimeters, or 1 meter, from the center of a 24-inch color LCD screen with a, 1080p HD pixels and a refresh rate of 60 Hz. After an initial training session of the emotion classification tasks, participants received the treatment, reported their expectation of treatment effects, performed another training session, manipulated at oxytocin treatment day, and started the task. Participants also reported their mood state via a digital visual analog scale at 3 time points through the testing phase, as well as in the form of an overall experience score at the end of the day. Following completion of testing day 2, participants were asked whether they believed that they had received oxytocin during the study, and if so, on which study day. What was the expectation induction? To induce the expectation of the effects of intranasal oxytocin, participants viewed a self-developed 5-minute video documentary in which an expert explained the basic mechanisms of the neuropeptide and elaborated on how oxytocin can positively modulate mood, as well as the perception of emotional stimuli such as emotional facial expressions. Alongside detailed textual information, this allowed for a highly standardized expectation induction. The video was shown on both testing days 1 and 2, and was followed by the self-administration of 4 puffs on each nostril of a saline nasal spray. Participants received the oxytocin information on 1 day, placebo, and the information to receive a saline solution, full condition, on the other, a counterbalanced order across participants. Participants were informed that it was possible to receive the same substance on both days. This was done to justify the identical setup on both study days. The allocated condition was revealed on the opening of a sealed envelope immediately after the video presentation. Deblinding was justified by the avoidance of potential placebo effects. On the day when participants allegedly received oxytocin, a hidden behavioral manipulation was accomplished within the second training phase of the emotion classification task described below. This was included to reinforce the belief that oxytocin improved the sensitivity to detect positive emotional expressions. This hidden manipulation was not done on the control day when the participants were informed that the solution was... So yeah, super interesting. They're obviously manipulating a lot of variables and trying to control for everything, even down to, distance to the screen that they're looking at, with a particular refresh rate. I don't know how you specifically justify or ground. Oh, it has to be 100 centimeters, whatever, away from the screen. So yeah, what was the emotion classification? It was implemented with MATLAB and the Psychophysics Toolbox extension. So the task required participants to label static images of emotional facial expressions of varying intensity as either happy, fearful, or neutral. Basically rating facial expressions. Participants were informed that some of the faces contained very subtle emotional cues. Stimuli were selected from the Radboud Faces database and morphed using Abrosoft Phantomorph so as to generate a continuum of emotional facial expressions from neutral to happy and from neutral to fearful. Right, so it's seems like they're taking the same face and they're manipulating whatever happy intensity, as they highlight here, or fearful intensity. Like, yeah, that's probably a variable that you have to control for. You can't just take, totally different faces, one happy, one fearful, and have them rate it. You'd probably have to control for whatever facial structure. And so they morph the faces. 2 pilot studies were conducted in order to create the 2 matched stimulus sets needed in the experiment. In the first pilot study, 10 participants rated 30 identities, 15 female, at 23 steps of emotional expression intensity, from 8 to 50% intensity and increment, and an additional 60% intensity in both happy and fearful emotions, along with a neutral expression for each identity. Each stimulus presented 8 times, resulting in a total of about 5,600 trials per participant. Of these 30 identities, 21 were chosen for the main experiment based on the quality and shape of their induced response function. Specifically, detection accuracy values derived from the pilot data allowed us to select images per emotion that produce 25%, 37.5%, 50.5%, and 75% classification accuracy. They centered the intensity range on 50% of detection accuracy. Based on these specifications, we created 2 stimulus sets that were matched for difficulty, both across sets and across both emotions. For happy facial expressions, these steps reflected approximately 6 law of happy intensity, like increasing intensity of happiness from 16 to 31%. For fearful facial expressions, the 5 steps corresponded to 19 up to 38% of fearful intensity. The final task began with a training phase, whereby individuals had to label 50 images from 5 identities not included in the experimental sets, with varying intensity of happy and fearful facial expressions, as well as 5 neutral faces. Participants then viewed the video documentary on oxytocin and were informed whether they were to receive oxytocin, placebo, or saline control on the current day. After the administration of the nasal spray, participants then performed a second training phase, 55 images from another 5 different identities. On the placebo day, the intensity of happy expressions subtly increased to specifically facilitate the recognition of happy faces and thus to reinforce the belief in oxytocin effects. The effectiveness of this shift was determined by a second pilot study. Pilot data showed that an increase of 46% in happy expression intensity was sufficient for improving detection accuracy of happy faces by 6%, while maintaining the subjective belief that both training and training plus sets were identical on the control day. Images in the first and second training phase were identical. Following the second training, participants performed one of the 2 parallel versions of the main task, counterbalance across testing. Trial orders were pseudo-randomized in order to ensure no consecutive presentation of these identities. The paradigm consisted of 352 trials per set with 8 at end, showing the 5 intensities of happy and fearful expressions, as well as the neutral expression. Each picture was presented 4 times. This resulted in 32 trials per intensity step, trials per emotion, blah. So it's like, okay, what they are doing, at least from what I gather, I only briefly glanced over the study. This is the first time that I went through its methodology. But it seems like, there's 2 training days, and they kind of like prime them, or they're priming some of them to basically think that oxytocin has this, beneficial effect. And it seems like they're doing that by, giving them sham oxytocin, and then having them rate, happiness intensity, as far as I can tell. And then it looks like they come back for a second training session, and then pretty much do the test again, and see how pretty much, if that priming, I guess, has any sort of downstream effects. That's sort of my overall understanding of what they're doing. And so then their overall results. Second. This study set out to investigate whether the induction of positive expectation modulates emotional phase perception in healthy individuals. Using an experimental protocol inspired by studies on placebo analgesia, we could indeed demonstrate that expectations of positive treatment effects of an alleged intranasal oxytocin application lowered the overall threshold for identifying happiness in facial stimuli, especially when only subtle facial cues were present. Right. So they were kind of duped into thinking that they are getting oxytocin, and then they were duped into thinking that the oxytocin is having this positive effect on you. At the same time, expression intensities were less well differentiated across emotions, indicating this positivity effect to be highly specific. Individual placebo responses were directly correlated with treatment expectation and self-reported treatment effects. Moreover, placebo effects were accompanied by mood state improvement, underlying the potential clinical relevance of positive expectations in the context of effective treatment. The current findings are highly relevant to understand how expectations shape psychological processes such as face perception. For example, it has recently been discussed whether expectations can actually improve cognitive function. On the one hand, placebo-induced expectations have been shown to increase subjective belief of behavioral improvements in the absence of actual changes in performance. On the other hand, there are a few studies demonstrating expectation effects on reaction times and memory. To the best of our knowledge, the current study is the first to explicitly address a potential enhancement of emotion recognition abilities by expectations. Importantly, our design allowed us to analyze psychometric response functions and thus to disentangle potential expectation effects on response tendencies and on discriminatory sensitivity. While our findings demonstrate a strong responsive bias towards the classification of happy faces, we also found participants to demonstrate a decreased ability to discriminate different intensities of emotional expressions when expecting the effects of oxytocin. Right, so again, they prime a set of people into thinking that oxytocin has this, basically a positivity effect. And then they test them again. And they see that this priming, basically this psychological priming, with this positivity effect, has downstream effects on their performance of recognizing other positive emotions. Thus, individuals' attention became less captured by subtle differences in the intensity of expressions and more focused on detecting happiness, relatively ambiguous stimuli. Neuroimaging findings on placebo-induced increased pleasantness of touch demonstrated such effects to rely on upregulated prefrontal networks that were recruited through positive expectations. With respect to the current study, one could speculate that placebo-induced expectations increased early sensory processing in face-sensitive brain regions, such as the fusiform face area, in response to even subtle facial cues, which might have lowered the threshold for identifying happiness. Most existing literature on positivity effects in facial emotion processing are from the field of healthy aging. A selective focus on positive information such as happy faces has thereby been attributed to a motivational shift in goal-setting behavior, and has been associated with better emotional well-being and attentional control. The importance of top-down control has been further underlined by neuroimaging findings showing a critical role of ventromedial prefrontal and limbic networks in the generation of a positivity effect. A similar emotion appraisal network is involved in mediating expectation effects, analgesia, hyperhedonia, and the processing of affective stimuli. The current finding of a selective bias in classification of happy faces suggests a similar recruitment of top-down control by the expectation of oxytocin effects. Like this is a variable that is subject to manipulation, essentially. As in, well, basically, seems like you can get some of the effects of oxytocin by just duping people into thinking that they're getting oxytocin, and then priming them with the effects of that. So in patients with major depressive disorder, positive mood expectations and improvements have been shown, and the extent of expectation is a significant mediator for the effectiveness of antidepressant treatment. Importantly, we also observed a placebo-induced improvement of mood states in addition to the effects on face classification performance. Placebo effects on mood states in healthy individuals have been recently reported in some studies, while others were not able to demonstrate effects. Formal models such as the predictive coding framework consider expectations as prior information, which in a Bayesian sense are integrated with incoming sensory information, such as likelihood, to form a percept. In the context of predictive coding, affective disorders have been linked with bottom-up deficits in predictive processing and an increased precision of negative prior beliefs. The attentional negativity effect, often observed in depression, could be one consequence of such negative prediction bias. It is manifested, for example, in the tendency to interpret neutral or subtle facial expressions as negative, and to generally prioritize the processing of negative information. Treating depression could therefore be conceptualized as equipping the brain with the resources to modify its internal model of the world, that is, changing the brain's relevant statistical structures to become less pessimistic, or to lean more into optimism. Antidepressant treatment has been shown to decrease a negativity bias while improving mood state. In our healthy sample, we could show that expectation alone able to modulate an attentional focus towards positivity and to improve mood. Given reports that up to 70 to 80% of treatment effects in antidepressant treatments are due to placebo mechanisms, our findings highlight the possibility that this might at least be partly driven by expectation effects induced by the pharmacological intervention. Right, so if in fact this is true, at pretty much like the majority of the effects of antidepressants come down to some sort of belief or expectation, and not to due to any sort of like changes in biochemistry or measurable physiological changes. Again, that should be taken into account, or if that can be taken into account treating depression, hopefully that results in better treatments for depression. As in, how do you dupe people into a placebo effect? I don't have the answer to that. I mean, they did it here, right? But can you ethically do that outside of a study or a clinical trial? I don't actually know. At the end of the last study day, we asked participants whether they thought they had received oxytocin at all. Although we acknowledge that such belief may vary gradually between participants, 1/3 of our sample denied this question and thus did obviously not believe our cover story. Which is like, yeah, interesting. It seems like there's 1/3 of them were on to the duping or the manipulation. Exploratively, contrasting believers and non-believers revealed differences in mood experience and online mood ratings, similar to the parametric relationship of expectation ratings and placebo effects. Participants who believed to have received oxytocin expressed a larger degree of mood improvement during the placebo condition than those that did not. Though belief was not found to impact the induced positivity bias, it is evident that maintaining the belief of receiving an active treatment was instrumental for the experience of a positive mood change. These findings are consistent with other studies showing that previous experiences of successful treatments are an important intrinsic determinant of placebo responses. Here, mood experience ratings provided at the end of each testing day indicated that positive expectation together with placebo effects significantly increased the retrospective experience of treatment effects, which in turn may modulate positive priors for future treatment effects. One second. Mood experience rating provided at the end of each testing day. Positive placebo effects and everything. Okay, so it seems, well, what I'm gathering here, there's like this synergistic effect, basically. Turning pessimist no, is probably cheaper than. Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. Or rather, I don't think you're wrong. It's just like, yeah. Can you ethically do, like, if, as they show here, you can kind of, at least a little bit, sort of induce a positive affect, or decrease, sort of like the negativity bias that some people have, but they're doing that by pretty much lying, or manipulation, as they even say explicitly here. And so, like, I guess the question becomes, like, can you ethically manipulate a person for a treatment of depression or to turn them more into an optimist? Like, basically, can a doctor knowingly prescribe a placebo, even if there's like a high likelihood that it'll actually work, right? Like, pretty much, yeah. Do the ends of potential benefits of treatment justify the means of being dishonest? I don't have an answer to that question. I don't think that's too pessimistic. I think that's more realistic. Despite several strengths, including the detailed assessment of expectation, experience and mood changes in a well-controlled crossover design, and the isolated measurement of changes in response criterion and perceptual sensitivity, we acknowledge that the presented work is not void of limitations. And also, in this study here, understandably so, they eventually told them that they're being manipulated. And I'm curious, how does informing, of the people that responded to the placebo, basically, or to like the sham oxytocin, how does the informing of them, of that, like, does it make the placebo actually no longer effective? Like, how does that actually translate into real life treatment? As in, like, if you have to keep up the lie for the treatment to be effective, like, can you knowingly keep up the lie for, like, whatever, 5 years, 10 years, the rest of their life? I don't know. The present study used a newly developed design in which a positive expectation induction included an active reinforcement of expectation, as was previously common in the context of placebo effects in, for example, pain and respiration. Yeah, these are all great questions that I don't think I have really good answers to. Expectation ratings and effects on mood and task performance suggest that this manipulation was successful. However, in such experimental designs, it is impossible to determine whether placebo effects are a manifestation of learning mechanisms such as classical conditioning, expectancies, or both. To understand the relative contribution of verbal instruction and classical conditioning for placebo effects in the affective system, future studies should acquire expectation ratings before and after an active reinforcement procedure, such as the one used in the present study. or directly compare placebo effects following only verbal instruction or an additional conditioning. Second, individuals differ in the nature by which they perceive and interpret emotional information, and it has also been questioned to what degree laboratory studies on isolated, static facial expressions generalize to real-life conditions. Therefore, the use of individualized, dynamic, and rich stimulus sets could allow for a more precise understanding of the impact of positive expectation on the processing of subtle emotional cues and could allow for an accurate modeling of behavior at the individual level. Finally, we observed that mood state ratings decreased significantly following the emotion classification task relative to the ratings provided immediately following the expectation induction. This reduction could result from habituation or fatigue effects, and or could reflect the rather short-lasting effects of our positive expectation induction procedure. Future work should aim to refresh participants' expectations and to strengthen maintain placebo effects. That is by implementing repeated feedback procedures. So it seems like there's like a waning for these. The positivity effect only lasts so long, and it seems like you need to boost it up from time to time. So to sum up, the current study could demonstrate a placebo-induced positivity effect and an increase in mood state following a newly developed procedure of expectation induction. The ability to induce a positive shift in one's motivation to recognize subtle emotional stimuli in the absence of any active treatment in a healthy sample is promising and has relevant clinical implications. As such, we feel that the current findings should encourage future work on individuals with mood disorders in order to further elucidate the influence of expectations on emotional processing and whether the addition of a positive expectation induction could improve outcomes for the treatment of affective disorders. And it's like, yeah, it's really tricky because as they appear to be saying here, and they have, experimental data to back it up, and there's other studies, essentially showing that, your expectations can potentially shape how effective a treatment is, or how you respond to treatment. And as they say here in this article, where, a significant portion of the effects of antidepressants, it seems like a significant portion is coming from placebo effects. And that potentially makes it even more difficult to treat depression, or things like depression. Because, understandably so, individuals with depression, they have a negativity bias that is, coming from somewhere, and exists for complicated reasons. But then, if by virtue of the fact that they have a negativity bias, that decreases the likelihood that they'll respond to treatment, then it's like, again, how do you break that cycle? Like, if their negative expectations reduce the likelihood that a treatment will work, well, how do you change someone or alter someone's negative expectations? It might be through something like this, but again, this requires manipulation and deceit, and I think understandably so. People would take issue with being deceitful to patients, in a medical setting. And so I think this super cool, but I think opens up, potentially a lot of ethical or moral questions. 1 second, I'm going to change, I think pretty much officially, my conversation with JohnnyScarlett is on hold. I'm going to change my stream title and category. 1 second. Well, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate that, and I don't take that for granted. So yeah, there's a bunch of content that I'm probably not gonna be able to get through, but I'm gonna do my best. Starting with one moment. I'm not sure where I want to start with. A whole bunch of cool stuff. Or at least cool to me. There's this one, basically, whoopsies. There's this cool study about how it seems like we're in the age of ChatGPT and AI, and it seems like AI, at least according to this study, AI might have better bedside manner than most actual, human doctors. I think we're going to start with... oh, Globus, welcome. Thank you so much for passing by. And also shout out to Globus. They were streaming for quite a while yesterday, and I think they were streaming for quite a while today. A fundraising charity stream. Which I hope, well, it looks like your charity stream, your fundraising stream went well. I've pretty much been lurking for quite a while, for as long as I possibly could. And so, yeah, I think you should be super proud and totally a great cause. And like I said, I wish I could have donated more. And I'm hoping somewhere down the line I'm in a position to do that. Yeah, I'm not surprised by it at all either, sadly. Even though I've been actually, pretty lucky with physicians and their bedside manner. Yeah. But well, one would hope and think that physicians would be at least trained to have good bedside manner, to be empathetic and understanding and compassionate. But there is actually research. It's super interesting, where I have at least one study, which has a pretty interesting title. The Devil's in the Third Year. Yeah, absolutely. Where it's like, okay, understandably, we desire doctors or medical professionals, or healthcare workers, to be empathetic and understanding and compassionate. And yet, it seems like how doctors are trained and medical curriculum, we are basically training them to kind of like have their empathy and compassion eroded. At least according to this one study here. This is just like one study. Where it's like, it seems like, and perhaps understandably so, as medical students progress through, medical school and the curriculum, that there's this erosion of empathy. Which, definitely, I would argue, not a good thing. But at the same time, I think it's illuminating and informative that empathy is basically a variable that you can modify. As in, this is not just like some unchanging personality thing. You can potentially increase someone's level of empathy, and you can erode it. And this is good information to have. Where this was a longitudinal study that was designed to examine changes in medical students' empathy during medical school and to determine when the most significant changes occur. It is concluded that a significant decline in empathy occurs during the third year of medical school, so it's pretty far into their medical training. I think generally speaking, at least in the United States, medical school is 4 years. So they're basically, 75% done at that point. And as they say here, it is ironic that the erosion of empathy occurs during a time when the curriculum is shifting toward patient care activities. This is when empathy is most essential. Implications for retaining and enhancing empathy are discussed. Which I'll probably cover this paper more in-depthly on a future stream. But like, yeah, I think it's super, it's unfortunate, but super cool. First of all, a study like this is being carried out, but also that we actually, this information that we now have, that hopefully can be taken into account, where there's clearly some sort of balance to be struck, where I think, as you correctly outline, if you're surrounded by a bunch of very challenging and tragic events, then there's an understandable erosion of empathy and compassion, and also compassion fatigue is a thing, where there's a balance to be struck, where you don't want your doctor to be so empathetic that if the patient is in pain, the doctor is in pain also, and can't carry out appropriate treatment. But you also don't want this cold, calculating robot of a physician. And so there's some sort of balance to be struck. And what that balance is, I guess, remains to be seen. But before we get into, AI and bedside manner of physicians, we're going to cover, maybe a darker side of science. As much as I love science, as much as I'm covering research, there is a not so nice side to science, or I guess I should say, quote unquote, science. This is basically bad science, where there's this website here, Retraction Watch, which is essentially responsible for, as the term implies, tracking retractions, although it doesn't track every single retraction that occurs, but I would say it does a pretty good job. And this is one of the more noteworthy websites that tracks these things. But editors at Nature have retracted a 2015 paper on breast cancer metastases, citing trouble with the data in the supplementary material. And Nature, basically one of the most respected and highly regarded scientific journals in the world. You have science and you have nature. As I said before, that's pretty much like the dream of any scientist to have on their CV or resume that they've published in Science or Nature. The paper, the hypoxic cancer secretome induces pre-metastatic bone lesions through lysyl oxidase, was first published in May 2015 and has been cited 352 times, according to Web of Science. This marks the second retraction for corresponding author Janine Erler, professor in cancer biology at the University of Copenhagen. As previously reported by Retraction Watch, Nature in 2020 pulled a 2006 paper on which she was first author because of image anomalies and the absence of original data. Two other papers co-authored by Erler have been corrected, and one additional paper has an expression of concern. So it seems like this particular author or researcher have a pattern of doing this, which is this poses the question of what do we do with researchers who have multiple instances of basically doing bad science, and whether this is intentional or not, I can't really say based off what they said so far, but it does seem like, oh wow, thank you so much for the raid, welcome raiders. And shout out to Talarex Live. I hope you had a great stream, and I hope you're having a great Saturday. But yeah, I am Corey Campbell. I'm a scientist, I'm a biochemist. I cover science, I cover news, I cover some politics as well, and the intersection between politics and science, which there totally is one. And maybe what I'm covering now might be at that intersection. But yeah, welcome raiders, super appreciated. Always great to be rated by Talarex. And also thank you so much for the follow, Buffy. I was totally, as usual, I'm lurking in your streams, Taler. and I was totally watching the Christian content that you were watching. Super entertaining. But yeah, welcome. We're covering some basically bad science right now, before we get into hopefully the good science. This marks... Oh, I already read that. So, the now retracted 2015 paper claimed to have found evidence that the enzyme lysyl oxidase can be a driver of metastasis to the bone of some breast cancers. A 2016 report published in the journal Bone and Material Research disputed some of the claims made in the paper, and in March 2018, an anonymous commenter on PubPeer pointed out issues with the paper's Western blots. So PubPeer, this is basically, researchers policing researchers. And that is pretty much a website sort of devoted to, like, pretty much dissecting research and trying to make sure it's pretty much like an extension of the peer review process. Kind of think of it that way. Hence why they call it PubPeer. So, according to the April 2023 retraction notice,
welcome to Flavor
the editors have retracted this paper because... Oh, thank you so much, Zangel Demon. Or maybe Z Angel Demon. Much appreciated. Happy to have you here. So they're calling out a specific figure, or a data figure. The editors have retracted this paper because, in their view, data in extended data figure 1D are unreliable. So when asked to comment on the retraction, Erler forwarded a press release that she said represents the views of the 14 authors who do not agree with the decision to retract the paper. Here's the statement. The University of Sheffield Institute of Cancer Research, University of Copenhagen, and the Technical University of Denmark have independently evaluated the evidence regarding the issue originally raised on PubPeer around 2 extended figure Western blots, where the legends did not clearly state that the beta-actin blots were sample processing controls. Our collective assessment is that there is insufficient scientific justification for a retraction, rather a simple text correction, as originally proposed and agreed with Nature. Should have been allowed to update the original figure legends. So, like, this is not, I don't know if it's common, but this is not unheard of in science, where, no surprise, when the actual researchers, get word that some of the research is being retracted, they're given a chance to respond, and this is their response, where it's like they basically view it as an unjustified retraction, where it seems like, it might have come down to maybe a simple labeling issue, or basically not enough labeling that a figure appeared to be deceptive or not giving all of the information, essentially. Anders Lund, director of the University of Copenhagen's Biotech Research and Innovation Center, where Erler is a group leader, said the Danish Board on Research Misconduct, a government agency, concluded there was no research misconduct. Professor Erler was criticized for having mislabeled the supplementary figures instead of the board's finding, but there was no evidence of fraud in this conduct. So it seems like it was not intentional. Even though, based off of this article here, there's multiple instances of this person's research basically being taken to task. It seems like they're kind of like accidentally taking the they're accidentally doing not the best science. In a call with Attraction Watch, Lund said the major conflict of interest cited in the statements refers to Erler's ex-husband, Rune Lunding, now a researcher at the Humboldt University of Berlin. Lunding is the only author who agreed with the editor's decision to retract the paper. There were attempts earlier to settle this in a different way, from retraction, corrections, and so on, said Lund, who is not one of the paper's authors. As far as I understand, Lunding did not accept those suggestions. That is a false claim. The data issues were investigated by an international review panel and antibody experts who advised the Nature editors in their decision. The editors made their decision independently, of course, and I have seen no data or evidence suggesting that it is not the right decision. And I guess I should attempt to illuminate what they're talking about. So they mention Western blots. And basically, it seems like a figure with a Western blot was being called into question. But, like, what is a Western blot? Or what does it look like? I mean, a simple Google Images. It's like a membrane, and there's bands. Let's see if I can find... Okay. So this is a stereotypical, or, example of a Western blot. You have, like, a membrane, and you have these vertical bands. And what they are doing is they are probing for proteins, for the presence of protein. Is that protein there? And they're usually probing for the presence of a protein in a big protein mixture. But very often, at least when it comes to publications. So here, if I should, the original, accept. So here, like, they are showing, like, the full Western. So this is pretty much, like, the entire Western in its entirety. So they're pretty much, like, showing, this is basically the raw data, and here's all of it. They're obviously labeling it, so you got to take the authors that they're labeling it correctly. And they're identifying, so that arrow coming in from the right-hand side, they're identifying the protein, the GAPDH protein, saying, hey, at that horizontal bar that's present, that means that protein is present in the samples that they are running in the lanes up top. So it's like up top is the samples, and you have the lane of each sample. They're pretty much saying, like, in rat ovary on the right-hand side, like, the presence of the protein is there. And that pretty much holds true for all of the rest of the sample. But when it comes to publications, they don't always show entire Western blot. And very often things are cropped. Maybe I have an example. Try and get an example. Right. This is an example of, a cropped Western blot. And you can see, if you compare on the left and the right, on the right-hand side, you have the full thing. Obviously, it's mostly, white space. All you're really interested is, like, the black horizontal bars. But what they very often do, like in publications like this, is, they pretty much just show the section of the membrane that they're interested in. And you just kind of, like, assume that, the rest of the membrane is blank. That might not actually be the case. A Western blot like this, like on the right, where, you just have in each particular lane, you have 5 lanes labeled at the top. Each lane generally only has, or at least, in the picture perfect Western blot like this that's shown on the right, you have, like, one horizontal, black bar. But they don't always look like that. They don't always look as clean as that for a variety of reasons. And, this cropping like this, you just kind of, like, take it for granted, or, you take it on faith, that, if you were to see the whole membrane or the whole blot, as they've shown on the right, that, oh yeah, it would look like that. Or, like, the rest of it, they're not, like, hiding anything, or basically there's no other additional bands showing up. It would point to something else, or would basically be, for lack of a better term, noise introduced to the Western blot. And so it seems like it's a sort of a similar thing going on here in the retraction. Where was I? Where, again, it seems like it wasn't intentional, but it doesn't seem like things were labeled appropriately, or maybe were labeled in a kind of, like, deceptive way. Where, you can maybe see this Western blot here. Labeling is important, because since you're not showing the whole thing, you got to make it clear, what is each individual band that's showing up. So, continuing on, Linding deferred to James Longden, a drug discovery biologist at E Therapeutics PLC, for further comment. Longden was a biologist at Linding's lab at the time the research was being conducted, although he is not an author of the retracted paper. About a year ago, Erler failed to replicate the Western blots after being asked to do so by Nature editors, according to Longden. If the data could have been replicated, the paper would not be retracted, Longden said in a call with the Traction Watch. But there is data in that paper that cannot be repeated, and so therefore, the editors think it should be retracted, and I agree with them. Again, going back to this is kind of like your picture-perfect, Western blot, whatever, super clean. And it's very clear as to what is showing up in each of the individual samples labeled at the top. But like I said, Western blots, more often than not, do not look picture perfect like this. And also, as part of science, reproducibility, like one of the pillars of science, even though I would say the way science is practiced and done, we really don't focus or put enough focus and emphasis on reproducibility. But this is certainly a thing with Western blots and many other techniques or data that you get, where it's very often not reproducible for whatever reason. And it totally happens, unfortunately. You'll get a Western blot like this, and it'll match your expectations, or it will result in a finding that you desire, in terms of like a novel finding. But it is not reproducible. You would expect it to be reproducible because you know the methodology, and the samples, etc., etc. All of these things on paper should be controlled for, and yet for whatever reason, it is not reproducible. And it does appear to totally happen that once a researcher, like literally they will run the same Western blot over and over, on paper the exact same way, but then once they get the Western blot that they want, once they get the finding that they want, they'll go with that one time only Western blot. Like this is unfortunately kind of like a known thing, science, where the vast majority of things that you try and do, they don't work, even though you're like on paper you're following a recipe, you're following a methodology. It really is kind of like there's an analogy for baking of like, generally speaking, if you follow the recipe for baking a cake, the end result is getting a cake. And so like on paper, following the methodology or the recipe for a Western blot, provided you are following the recipe, and researchers, they follow methodology, you should get the same Western blot and the same result. But it does totally happen that, to use the baking analogy, you follow the recipe for baking a cake and you get a pie. But you'll go with the pie if it happens to be like the pie that you want, or the result or finding that you want. And it's a good thing here, okay? It seems like, when the research was being questioned, the Nature editors, they asked the researchers to basically, hey, can you repeat this Western blot? Is this reproducible? And it seems like it was not reproducible, and therefore that was one of the justifications for the retraction. Which that is a good thing. If it's not reproducible, then you're not doing good science, or you're not doing reproducible science, which science should be reproducible. But yeah, it's totally tricky, and it totally occurs way more than it should, where you run an experiment, and you can run an experiment like 20 times, and you'll get 20 different results. But you'll go with the one result that let's say the novel, desirable finding that you want. Happens way more frequently, like I said. Absolutely. So, as I've gotten older, I'm way more into pie. Although, really, the only pie that I love is pecan pie. The rest of the pies, not a huge fan of. So the co-corresponding author, Alison Garland, a professor of biology at the University of Sheffield, declined to comment on the record. A spokesperson for Nature told Retraction Watch, "I hope you will appreciate that, owing to our confidentiality policy, we cannot discuss the specific details regarding the editorial handling of individual cases." So like that is a good thing. Or again, if research not reproducible, then again, you are arguably not doing science. For this. But on the topic of bad science, unfortunately, there appears to be multiple instances of bad science. But also, unfortunately, need to open this in incognito, get past their whatever, them blocking the article. That. But yeah, unfortunately, it seems like kind of like bad science. So, I covered a retraction, which appeared to be basically unintentional. At least, again, according to all the information that's contained here. It seems to be just kind of unintentional, mislabeling of figures, etc., etc., and that they were not actively trying to deceive or falsify data or come to false conclusions. But it does totally happen where data is fabricated. And this was published a couple days ago. University investigation found prominent spider biologists fabricated falsified data. McMaster University has finally released the results of its investigation into allegations of data fraud by behavior ecologist Jonathan Pruitt. And McMaster University, that's a Canadian university in Ontario, I believe Hamilton, Ontario. And it's like one of, I think it's one of, if not the most kind of like research-intensive universities in Canada. So finding that the once widely celebrated scientists did engage in fabrication and falsification. The Canadian University announced the news in a statement today after sharing it recently with co-authors on some of Pruitt's now retracted papers. McMaster told Science 2 years ago that its investigation, conducted by a hearings committee, was concluded, and that Pruitt was leaving the school after a settlement. But to the frustration of the ecology community, it did not at the time publicly detail any findings about misconduct. Now says the committee found that Pruitt generally failed to meet the requirements expected of a tenured professor under the university's research integrity policy when conducting research. I can't believe the university is actually publicly saying this, says Kay Lukowski, who co-authored 3 papers with Pruitt that were specifically addressed in McMaster's statement today. It's a big relief they call it fabrication. They call it falsification. They didn't hedge their bets. Lukowski says she last heard from McMaster when they informed her in July 2022 that the school had settled with Pruitt to terminate their position. I assumed that was the end of it. I never thought I would hear anything else, she says. Lukowski was among the first to raise questions about Pruitt's work. In January 2020, he announced on Twitter that she was retracting a paper on which she was the first author and co-author. There were an unexpected number of duplicate values that I had never previously noticed, shared. Going on to explain that because Pruitt could also not explain the anomalies in the data, their findings on the social behavior of ants were ultimately unsupported by data. 2 other papers that Lukowski co-authored with Pruitt would go on to be retracted. and that led to scrutiny from many of the other co-authors as well. To date, 15 papers of Pruitt's have been retracted over the past 3 years. A moment. After a series of high-profile findings early in their career, Pruitt had been given a prestigious Canada 150 Research Chair title in 2018. But when the McMaster investigation into what became known as Pruittgate ended, they were placed on leave and eventually resigned from McMaster University. You can totally ask a question. I believe I have Ask Me Anything in the title, but let me double check that. Yes, I do. Someone I know has been increasingly repeating talking points they've heard from Dr. John. I definitely know Dr. John Campbell. I think he's one of my channel points redemption. One of my super high channel point redemption. And it's basically a joke. Who is motivating them away from taking future COVID vaccines, and who now has a fear of new mRNA vaccines replacing the proper way of producing vaccines, which they as safer. The percentage that mRNA vaccines will cause great harm. Does this now So I'm definitely not a fan. So first of all, despite the last name, I have no affiliation to John Campbell. Thankfully, and there's nothing to apologize for. Don't expect you. I don't expect anyone to keep track of my points redemption. But I have many thoughts on Dr. John Campbell, and he's a channel points redemption for a reason. It's because of the people that have been around here for a while. I think they know that I'm not a fan at all, and I think they are engaging in misinformation or disinformation. I'm not sure if it's intentional or not. I can't say whether it's misinformation or disinformation, but at the very least, I don't think they're a good source of accurate, unbiased information or data. So to answer your question, or your other questions, which are totally great questions. So early on, or in the early days of, let's say, the pandemic, and I guess early days of Dr. John Campbell's YouTube career, or YouTube channel, I would say, in the beginning, I thought that they were providing pretty good, up-to-date information. But then it kind of really took a turn, pretty quick and pretty rapidly, or not a pretty hard turn rapidly. And yeah, when it comes to the mRNA vaccines, which I've covered quite a bit of the research on the mRNA vaccines, well, specifically the COVID mRNA vaccine, where and this is an evolving situation. So I want to make sure that I answer your questions properly. So the perception that the mRNA vaccines will cause great harm. So I'm assuming, since as far as I know, generally speaking, when people say mRNA vaccines, they're referring to the COVID one. So the evidence so far, but this is an evolving situation. The evidence so far is that overall, the mRNA vaccines are not associated with any significant adverse events. There's a little bit of a caveat or asterisk where, there's a lot of talk about myocarditis and pericarditis and effects on the heart, especially when it comes to the demographic of young men, generally speaking, men under the age of 35, and that is a little bit of different calculation. If you are, a male, let's say under the age of 35 or under the age of 40, where, there appears to be an increased risk of myocarditis, but even then, myocarditis and pericarditis encompass kind of broad categories, where even in the case of the individuals that experience the unfortunate side effect of myocarditis or pericarditis, it tends to be pretty mild. And that they, as far as we can tell, they make, it looks like they make a full recovery, but we don't have any long-term data, obviously. So, really hard to come to any final conclusions, or we can't come to any real final conclusion as of now. But of the data that I've seen, and I've covered quite a bit of it, even the people that experience any sort of effects on the heart, the vast majority are mild, and they appear to make pretty much a full recovery from what we can tell so far. That might change in the future once we get more long-term data. But outside of that, there does not appear to be any other significant risks associated with the mRNA vaccine, at least from the data that we have so far. But we don't have any long-term data, at least when it comes to the COVID vaccines. We do actually have some long-term data from other mRNA vaccines that are still in the pipeline. People think that, the mRNA vaccines, the COVID mRNA vaccines were like the very first ones. They might have been the first ones to be approved, but they were not the first ones that were in development. We actually have quite a bit of research about mRNA vaccines going back a decade that, again, I've covered on stream. That, on the whole, they don't appear to be associated with any significant adverse events so far. But we don't have data going back 50 years, or obviously not 75 years, etc., etc. But we do have decades of data. And even then, the mRNA vaccines, the COVID mRNA vaccines, they code for, generally speaking, they code for the spike protein. And their overall mechanism of action is that, yes, we get you to produce the spike protein. Your body mounts an immune defense against the spike protein, and that confers protection. The presence of antibodies resulting from the spike protein confers protection against, generally speaking, severe outcomes from COVID infection. But this is, like I said, an evolving situation where now for most people, I think most people have had some sort of combination of either infection or infection combined with vaccination, or like multiple infections with multiple vaccinations and boosters. Where like I can speak for only myself and my experience. As far as I know, I have not had COVID. And I've had, I think now 5 shots of an mRNA vaccine. I had the initial 2 doses, and then I think I've had at least 2, if not 3 boosters. And given the state now, or given the situation now, let's say, there's a surge of COVID cases in the winter, in 6 months from now, 6 to 8 months from now. Would I get another booster? I don't know, actually. Given the fact that, generally speaking, the severity of COVID appears to have decreased, and that I've had at least 4 doses of an mRNA vaccine. And also, I think it's fair to say, if you've been around my channel for a while, I lead a very healthy lifestyle. Not perfectly healthy, but I take my health seriously. Where it's I exercise a lot. I follow a particular diet that works for me. And so even though I'm immunocompromised, I'm pretty confident in my body's ability, combined with the vaccinations that I've had, that I'm at a very minimal risk of having a severe outcome if I were to get infected by SARS-CoV-2. So that is my experience. And what I would say is from all of the data that I have seen in regards to mRNA vaccines, they do appear to be overall, they appear to have an overall better safety profile than your traditional vaccines that are not mRNA based. But again, I will fully admit we don't have, data going back 50 years. how much of the myocarditis is due to the vaccine technology and how much of that is due to the pathogen itself. COVID. My understanding is that a full infection can cause more damage to people's. So you pretty much hit the nail on the head. Where let me get up actual. So I don't think we know the actual mechanism, but I in a little bit I've looked into it. And also, there's also the fact that we have more and more emerging evidence that long COVID is a thing, and that just as we don't know the long-term effects of these COVID mRNA vaccines, we also don't know the long-term effects of COVID infection. And you are correct, or potentially correct, in that it does seem to be the case, based off of the data that I've seen, that even though there's this potential risk for myocarditis and pericarditis associated with the vaccine, that appears to hold true, if not equally so or more so, with COVID infection. And we have emerging evidence. This is as of September 12th, 2022. Not super old. But yes, a total of about 2,500 reports of myocarditis, pericarditis were identified after administration of primary series COVID-19 mRNA vaccination, and 269 after the booster dose program during the study period. The incidence of myocarditis, pericarditis following booster dose vaccination was lower than that of primary series. The results show significantly high reporting of myocarditis, pericarditis following the administration of primary, blah, blah, blah. So, the overall conclusion, this study found that the booster dose of COVID-19 mRNA vaccination, when compared with primary series course, did not lead to an increase in the risks of myocarditis, pericarditis. And I even have it filtered. And again, it also matters what type of vaccination that you get. There appears to be some slight differences in the mRNA vaccines, but nothing world-changing. Or yeah, I have at least, a dozen studies going over myocarditis. Let's see if I can filter it. Trying to. Right. So, yeah, as you said, the angel demon. There does totally appear to be a risk of myocarditis and pericarditis associated with SARS-CoV-2 infection. And it does seem to be that, at least might be outdated, but some of the older data that I've seen, going back, old, I say old this is 2021, or 2020, 2021, that it's the incidence of myocarditis and pericarditis, those who have been infected, also appears to be quite high, and that even then, or associated with infection, outcomes appear to be even more severe. As in, like I said, even with the mRNA vaccines, even if you're in the highest risk group, as they outline here, adolescent and young men, highest risk of myocarditis, even then, it seems like the course for the majority of them appears to be mild. And again, they make, as far as we can tell, a full recovery, but still fully remains to be seen. So like, if I'm making a health decision for myself, and if I'm concerned about my heart health, which I think it's fair to say that I am personally concerned with my heart health. I lead a very healthy lifestyle. I would personally, for myself, I have gone with the vaccine than with the infection. As in, I would much prefer to get the mRNA vaccine and take any risk associated with that than risk a full-on infection from SARS-CoV-2. Let's just say I would much rather take my risk with something that's engineered by humans, and it's engineered by humans to be therapeutic but still have flaws, than something engineered or evolved by nature, that as it's pretty much an unknown at this point. This is, even though we've gathered a lot of data and we've done a lot of characterization, SARS-CoV-2 is still kind of like a black box in terms of virology and how we understand it as a virus. And so I'm totally going, for me personally, with the human-engineered vaccine. The person I know who was quoting Dr. also said that they wouldn't get the next COVID booster because of the perception that COVID is so weak now. The risk of the vaccine outweighed the risk of getting COVID itself. However, I thought infection, COVID attacks the immune system. That tells me that immunity. So there's totally data that immunity wanes, for sure, and that's where it becomes a tricky question, and that's where it's on I would say, a case-by-case basis, where based off of the data that I've seen, which might be outdated, you pretty much get like some of the highest protective effects from a combination of both vaccination and prior infection. And so let's say, for example, you've had a prior infection, and then you've gotten some course of the vaccine, maybe the initial 2 doses and a booster. Then it's like, do you need extra protection in that context? I can make the case that it can go either way. Depends on how you assess your own risk. But let's say, for example, for myself, let's say I can say with 100% confidence that I've had no prior infection. And that, I've just had a course of the initial 2 doses, and I've had like 2, if not 3 boosters. And I know that immunity wanes. And my last booster was in December of last year, or December 2022. That I know, like, for sure, because like right before Christmas. And I remember going to a vaccination site. And so we know that, immunity wanes. And so if in fact I've had no prior infection, and let's say there's a surge 6 months from now, let's say in this coming December, there's a surge, would I get another booster? As I sort of said, I would maybe lean towards no. But what would change my decision? Or like what would put me in the firm no? For me, it's a little bit of a coin toss. But let's say next month I get a confirmed case of SARS-CoV-2, or I get infected with COVID. Given that, pretty much I'll be confident that in December I'd be much more in the no camp of like, yeah, I probably don't need another booster, because like I've been infected and I've had like at least 4 doses, if not 5 doses of the vaccine, and so I'm pretty confident in my level of protection. And so that's where like a difficult conversation to have, because like now pretty much like the situation is unique for like so many people, where like there are some people out there that have never had a COVID infection, They're probably a little bit in the minority, but those people exist. And there's the people that exist on the spectrum. Like, there are some people that have had a COVID infection and they've had 1 dose of the vaccine. And then there's ones that have, infection plus 2 doses. There's infection plus like 3 doses. And then like it depends on the time of the last dose. And so it's really tricky. Where at this point I'm not a clinician or a doctor, but it's almost impossible to make any sort of universal prescriptions at this point in time, because like now, much like everyone is in a different situation. Like as opposed to like before, going back like 2 years ago, or no, 3 years ago. Yeah, 3 years ago. Of like whatever, the summer of 2020, where like, at that point, the minority of people had an infection. We were like pretty much in the midst of the pandemic, pretty much at the height of it, or close to the height of it. And then like the vaccines came a little bit later. I think they came in like the winter, or like December of 2020. And so like at that point, it is, for the vast majority of people, virtually a no-brainer of like, you can make the universal prescription that if you're eligible for the vaccine, it's in your best interest to take it. Since at that point, most people had not had a COVID infection. And also, this different strain, etc., etc. And there's, no prior immunity, etc., etc. Whereas opposed to now, it's very difficult to make any sort of universal prescriptions, because like, the situation is so different for everybody. And we also have a little bit more, or a lot more information about the vaccine, about the virus, etc., etc. And that's why, yeah, virtually for everyone on a case-by-case basis. But like on the whole, you're asking about the safety profile of the mRNA vaccines. Based off the data that we have so far, the safety profile of them looks really great. And I think there's very little reason to believe, never know, but there's very little reason to believe that over the long term, the safety profile would not hold up. As in, I think what we observe now with the mRNA vaccine, I expect that to be true. I don't expect them to have any sort of real long-term effects. Where you know enough about mRNA to at least make some claims about it. Might be something to test. Might be a simpler way to test active antibodies in someone.
Welcome to Flavor Country.
Thank you so much for the follow. Willette, much appreciated. Happy to have you here. And yeah, totally. If you're in a position to get your antibody levels tested, but that not everyone has that luxury, I would definitely like to have that test personally, because that is one way to determine if you've been previously infected with the virus, where if you have antibodies directed towards the nucleocapsid protein, then it's a virtual guarantee that you've been previously infected, because if you've only been exposed to the vaccine, you should only have antibodies directed towards the spike protein. The mRNA vaccine, a result in the generation of the spike protein. And so, like, if you have antibodies directed against the nucleocapsid circulating in you, those antibodies should only be coming from you being exposed to fully formed virus. And I know that test is available because I've looked into it. Like I said, I would want to take that test, because at least I would be able to answer the question of whether or not I've been exposed to the virus. But it does not appear to be super cheap. Not super expensive. I think it's a few $100s. But as of right now, more than what I'm willing to spend. Where was I? Ooh, so this is an excellent question. The rapid antigen test, if you're talking about the LFA test, I want to make sure I understand your question properly. That might be misunderstanding it. Are you asking, does the rapid antigen test, does it test for prior infection, or does it mostly test for, the presence of antibodies against the nucleocapsid? Those are like two separate things. And I want to make sure that I'm providing accurate information and answering the question that you're asking. Where was I? Oh yeah, so we were covering so if you're asking the question of whether the rapid antigen tests can tell me if I've been exposed to the virus, the answer is no. As basically, if I took a rapid antigen test now, regardless of what it says, either positive or negative, it would not tell me anything about prior infection. I believe the only way, as far as I can tell, that you can test whether you've been infected from the virus or if you've had a prior infection is from testing whether you have the presence of antibodies circulating, antibodies against nucleocapsid. Because the rapid antigen, the rapid antigen test should not be testing for that, because the rapid antigen test, typically speaking, it's like something that you spit on, or like it's, the sample is coming from your saliva. You would not have those types of antibodies present in your saliva. Those types of antibodies will be circulating like in your bloodstream. You would need a blood sample to test for those antibodies. Right. This case of scientific fraud. Yes, exactly. If I remember correctly, it's been a minute since I looked into it, even though there was a point where I was diving deep into all the testing, PCR and rapid antigen tests. But the rapid antigen tests that are either like a nose swab or like a saliva sample, basically some sort of bodily fluid that's not blood, typically from the nose or like from saliva. You are testing for the presence of viral particles, typically. As in, like, you're basically shedding virus. And therefore, like, that's why we use it for infection, because if you're shedding virus and there's the presence of viral particles in, let's say, your saliva, or like in your mucous membranes in your nose, then, like, you pretty much there's a very high likelihood, if not certainty, that you are infected, and the virus is actively replicating in you. As opposed to like antibodies directed towards the nucleocapsid, those would be circulating in your bloodstream from a prior infection. It's like antibodies for the antibodies, maybe, as in like maybe I'm not sure 100% what you mean, but yes, I'm not 100% sure exactly what you're asking, if you want to clarify. So one test for the virus shedding, while the other test for the presence of long-living antibodies in the blood for having been infected and then cleared the infection. Yes, exactly right. Exactly. I can bring up, so I want to get through this article, and then I'll bring up the actual research of what I'm talking about, because I do actually have an abundance of research. Not COVID related, but like testing for antibodies, or the presence of antibodies. It's actually a wide-scale practice in a medical setting, especially when it comes to some pharmaceutical applications and drugs. This is a little bit, it's called therapeutic drug monitoring. A little bit of a specialty, or a little bit of an area of expertise. But just gonna get through this article, because covering the scientific fraud is pretty important. So let's see. Yeah, retraction, duplicate values. Right. Oh yeah. So yeah, this researcher, Pruitt, they were a high-profile researcher at McMaster, and they were given a Canada Research Chair title in 2018, which this is actually like a fairly prestigious title. I know. I'm aware of faculty members that kind of like hold this position, and it's a pretty prestigious position. And money very often, grant money or funding money very often gets thrown at them as a result. In a response to Science Insider Today, Pruitt declined to comment on McMaster's probe. I'll be available to chat in the fall when my first book comes out, they replied. When accusations against Pruitt first surfaced 3 years ago, many journals initially waited for McMaster to conduct his investigation, particularly in light of letters from Pruitt's lawyers urging them to not immediately retract any papers. But once some editors obtained the original data for the papers and saw that the university investigation would take time, the editors went ahead and decided whether to retract on their own. It became obvious that it might be a long time before the decision came from McMaster, says Susan Healy, was executive editor of the journal Animal Behavior, which published and subsequently retracted 3 of Pruitt's papers. Healy suggests that McMaster may have needed time to get through a thorough investigation of a large set of papers, but she adds, "We decided ultimately we can make the decisions without them." Animal Behavior, at which Healy now oversees publishing ethics, has yet to be contacted directly by McMaster on the conclusions of its investigation. Oh, absolutely. 100%. Like I said, yeah, if they were a Canada Research Chair, and like very often, like I said, I don't even think it's very often. I think it's pretty much like guaranteed that if you hold one of these esteemed positions as a Canada Research Chair in like whatever position, you get quite a bit of influx of money. This money is coming from the public. Because like these are positions, so this is in Canada, and like a lot of Canadian universities, and they take in public money, and a lot of the vast majority of research that takes place in universities is coming from public funds, and so they almost certainly would have taken, they would have been given a lot of money coming from the public to fund the research. And it turns out a lot of the research has been fraudulent. So huge, 100% huge breach of trust. And waste of money. Totally waste of money. McMaster's summarized findings span 8 papers of Pruitt and conclude that they committed data duplication and inadequate record keeping. The evidence presented to the university on the 3 papers co-authored with Leskowski established that data and sequences of data were duplicated in all 3 papers. The committee concluded, adding that it was also satisfied with that Dr. Pruitt engaged in fabrication and falsification with respect to whether spiders were collected for the study conducted, and concerning which spiders were used and whether the assays were conducted to support the paper. The committee also said that there are no statistical or biological explanations for the types of duplication observed in the papers. Other papers investigated, the committee concluded that Pruitt failed to keep complete and accurate records of their data in a manner that would allow for verification or replication. Lena Grinstead, a co-author of Pruitt's on 3 papers, also shared yesterday on Twitter an email notice from McMaster saying it had found that Pruitt fabricated data in those papers as well, the most recent of which was retracted by Nature. It has indeed been a painful journey for everyone involved, Grinstead, an evolutionary biologist at Portsmouth University, tweeted. Hopefully we've all learned some valuable lessons through it all. This is going to be similar to the situation with Andrew, who published Ghost Vaccine and colon and so there's definitely some parallels to be drawn in terms of like fraud. So and it's like in the title of the article where it's like fabricated and falsified data. So like pretty much explicitly fraud, which huge huge misconduct science. And like Andrew Wakefield, pretty much, well, yeah, pretty much all the research was retracted. The research was shown to be fraudulent. So totally large parallels. I think the only difference that maybe, you know, in most people's eyes, understandably, makes it more severe in Andrew Wakefield is that there are clear clinical implications. As in, like, this researcher, who's an ecologist, if I remember correctly, and they're like studying like insects or ants. So, you know, even their research being demonstrated to be fraudulent, definitely bad, unethical, immoral, not in the public good, but doesn't affect any patients, or, you know, there's no measurable effect at, let's say, a human level, aside from, like, you know, the moral indiscretion, as opposed to like Andrew Wakefield, you know, as a result of their fraudulent research, you know, they contributed to this growing movement of being anti-vaccine, and the sentiment that, you know, vaccines contribute to autism, like that still appears to be a prevalent sentiment, and so they have contributed to this false narrative, and so, like, you know, I think it's pretty safe to say, at least in my opinion, that human lives were affected, and that there were clear clinical implications as a result of their fraudulent research. I think that's what would make the distinction for most people's eyes, and even myself included, in that I don't have any real objective basis for this, but, you know, I just totally feel way more negative to Andrew Wakefield and what they did than to what this researcher did, where, like, I totally don't approve of any scenario. But if I'm picking one that I'd prefer to occur over the other, I would prefer this over what Andrew Wakefield. Yeah, it got published in Nature, and Nature, like, very well respected, high impact journal. Not to say that impact factor really matters. I don't like these metrics. I think these are silly. But at the end of the day, like, Nature is a respected, widely regarded journal. So wrapping up, before, yeah, I do want to get what you brought up in terms of, like, antibodies and stuff. That's a super great question. Some journal editors say McMaster's official conclusion of misconduct won't change much in terms of investigations and retractions. Most journals that were paying attention did that already, says Daniel Bolnick, an evolutionary biologist at the University of Connecticut, who was a co-author on some of Pruitt's papers and editor-in-chief of the American Naturalist. Once the scandal broke, he began to investigate all of Pruitt's papers published in the journal. My perspective as editor was, do I believe the biological conclusion? And the answer was no, Bolnick said. Whether that was because of data fabrication or incompetence, harder for him to discern, and so he left that judgment to Master. They clearly came back with the conclusion it was fabrication and falsification, Bolnick said. Laskowski does think this might help other co-authors clear the record with journals. It also signals for her and others some closure to a 3-year ordeal. She often gives a data integrity talk that includes her story, and typically ends by saying that the ecology community believes that Pruitt fabricated data. Now I get to update it and say, here's the end. And this, you know, brings to mind, on this topic, I've covered this before. Yeah, exactly. No, I think, you know, you can produce the same outcome, but if it's through negligence as opposed to, you know, malice, I think people, understandably so, myself included, like, take issue with, even though, like, both are, can produce the same outcomes. But, you know, this brings to mind, and going back to, like, clinical implications, and, you know, how do we rate fraud? Where, you know, in this research, you know, this bug researcher, or spider researcher. Yeah, spider biologist. It's like, okay, whatever. They've falsified data uh, when it comes to their research on spiders, which, falsification, fabrication, like always a bad thing. But even though spiders are cool, and there's totally a lot of things that can come out from spider research that has human applications. I think most people would, understandably come to the conclusion that, okay, whatever, fraudulent research in the spider world, not the biggest deal. At least in comparison to, I've covered this article before and this situation before, where it's like, this is fraudulent research, going back to like the Wakefield situation, where it's like there are clear clinical implications, and downstream effects that are still occurring today in terms of a growing anti-vax movement that Andrew Wakefield has significantly contributed to, and still the ever-present sentiment that vaccines cause autism. And then there's also fraudulent research like this, where like, this researcher, this very noteworthy researcher that appeared to be big in the world of Alzheimer's research. It seems like they also fabricated and falsified data, or pretty much, they participated in fraud, scientific fraud, and it resulted in, looks like, researchers, going down the wrong avenue of Alzheimer's research, where it seems like, this researcher's findings were the basis for a lot of future research, where it's like, oh, this finding, we should do way more follow-up research because it looks so promising. But if the original research was fraudulent, it pretty much might have led generations of researchers down a dead end, where you pretty much like might have set back, a whole domain of Alzheimer's research. Whereas they say here, in kind of like the byline, the article, a neuroscience image sleuth finds signs of fabrication in scores of Alzheimer's articles, threatening a reigning theory of the disease. Where again, the findings from this particular research, it was the foundation, or as they say, a reigning hypothesis of like, oh, they might have figured something out about Alzheimer's, but turns out might have been all based off of fraudulent or fabricated findings. Where like again, and this researcher like trained other research, who then pursued that avenue of research. So again, like pretty much, as almost literally as you can, like leading people towards a dead end. And again, like setting back Alzheimer's research. Which, again, all fraud is bad, all scientific misconduct is bad, but I think most people would, put this as like, very severe, and I think understandably, though they're both fraud, people view this as like less severe. But to address the antibody issue brought up earlier, great thing that you brought up. Just want to make sure I so long living antibodies in blood. So yeah, exactly, it's just like a snowball effect of like this fraudulent research. It just leads like just more bad research, through no faults of the subsequent research. They were like, they understandably placed stock, or like they thought the research was true because they had no reason to believe that research was fraudulent, until now. Okay. So, like, yeah, antibodies and, like, waning immunity, or, like, circulating antibodies. And this is a little bit of an area of expertise of mine. Both from personal experience and both from a scientific standpoint. As someone who has literally, who has taken the blood test for the presence of anti-drug antibodies, because I take a pharmaceutical that is protein-based, and you can generate antibodies, against a medication that you're taking, which I have experienced multiple instances of. And so, like, how does this relate to, whatever, COVID, and antibodies? Well, I mean, at the end of the day, so, like, what's happening in the case of COVID? Multiple things, starting with, like, the COVID vaccine. The COVID vaccine, the mRNA vaccines, as mentioned, they result in production of the spike protein in the vaccine recipient. And then that spike protein, your immune system recognizes it, as essentially, a foreign protein. And then your body will mount an immune response to the spike protein, and then it will result in the generation of antibodies against the spike protein. And then if you have antibodies against the spike protein, and it's the spike protein that allows for the fully formed virus to gain entry into your cells, well, if you have antibodies blocking the spike protein, well, then they should not be able to get into cells or infect your cells, your respiratory cells, more specifically. And so, like, pretty much the overall process is, like, your body is generating antibodies against a protein. In this case, with the mRNA vaccine, the COVID mRNA vaccine, it's against the spike protein. But it totally happens that now we have these class of pharmaceuticals or drugs that are protein based, as in, like, pretty much like the most profitable drugs are all biologics, or like whatever, half of them in the top 10. Do top 20, over 20. Okay, well, obviously. But then number 2, which, like, if you're living in the United States, you probably see advertisements for this. But, like, this is like the second, most profitable drug in 2021. After one of the COVID vaccines. Like, what is Humira? It makes me wonder. About the signs I saw in footage of the trucker convoy. They perceive all signs to be bought off and call it science. Yeah. Could it be a projection of what their own ideologically aligned or paid actors in scientific research are doing? Could this be some of the actions a holder of such views would look to for proof science is unreliable? These are all super fantastic questions. Of, like, there is a growing anti-science movement. Some of it understandable, since, like, as I just went through, there are actual cases of both intentional and unintentional scientific fraud. Now, is it widespread? I would say no, but I would say it's also, like, way more common than it should be. That's for sure. And so it's like, what results in these anti-science, like, sentiments? It's really tricky. I've covered sort of some of the psychology around anti-science. That is, like, complicated. But yeah, I don't want to get too. I have to, like, do a whole stream, like, devoted to this. It's interesting. Oh, and Smash, welcome. Thank you so much for passing by. How are you doing? I hope you're doing well. My understanding is that your immune system will recognize the protein sooner for having seen it before from the vaccine, and thus mounts it. Yes, exactly. You're kind of like you are priming the immune system. You're pretty much like giving them, some insider information that they should be able to mount a response sooner. So, how does this relate to like pharmaceuticals? Pharmaceuticals like this, Humira, which is like the number 2, at least as of 2021. But if you go back to before the mRNA vaccines, Humira has been like at the number 1, or like close to number 1, for like the past like decade. And this is a medication that I personally have taken because I have this disease, and I took it for over pretty much almost exactly a decade. Super effective. But like, what is Humira, and how does this relate to like antibodies and drugs, etc., and like immune response? So like, what is the actual name? Is adalimumab, and it is an antibody. It's an anti-TNF antibody, but like, how does that relate? Let's say antibodies, or antibody response in your body, and COVID, and the spike protein. So Humira, or whatever, the molecule name, the antibody name, adalimumab, it's an antibody, and the antibody is a protein, as in just like the spike protein is a protein. Humira is a protein. It's just like a different protein, and it's a protein that is directed against this target, TNF alpha, or tumor necrosis factor alpha, part of your immune system, or it's a cytokine of basically a chemical messenger of the immune. So the overall thought process is, as kind of like grand scheme picture, is like in certain conditions, very often autoimmune conditions, this is upregulated, or we see that there's a lot of this circulating, and this is part of the immune system. So like, as I say here, important part for treatment of autoimmune diseases. So for autoimmune diseases, there's very often, if not almost always, you have the presence of inflammation, or some sort of inflammatory response occurring. And so the overall, let's say, strategy is like, okay, for some conditions, using my own condition as the example, but this holds true for, let's say, rheumatoid arthritis. But for Crohn's disease patients, we're observing that they have high circulating levels of tumor necrosis factor alpha. So then the thought process was, in the development of this antibody, is like, okay, if they have high circulating levels of TNF alpha, and the TNF alpha is playing a part in the overactive inflammatory response, well then, if we administer an antibody, and this antibody binds to the TNF alpha, okay, so it basically neutralizes it, so it should be down-regulating the TNF alpha. So if it's down-regulating the TNF alpha, it should be down-regulating the inflammatory response. And for a lot of patients, that is actually what occurs. That is what occurred for me for like a decade. Where it's like, yeah, this tumor necrosis factor alpha, it appears to be playing a major part in the inflammatory response, and that's why you see these high circulating levels in, let's say, patients like myself who have Crohn's disease. And so like, okay, let's find a way to down-regulate it, and maybe hopefully decrease the inflammation. So the strategy that was employed was drugs like this, adalimumab, an antibody, where it's like, that's the target, so bind to it. So just as in the case of the mRNA vaccine, the COVID mRNA vaccine, you're exposed to the spike protein, and then you generate antibodies to the spike protein. So those antibodies, if they encounter a future spike protein, let's say coming from the full-formed virus, the presence of the antibodies, they should neutralize the spike protein. That should prevent it from gaining entry into your cells, basically being able to infect you, or dramatically decrease its ability to infect you. And so it's the same principle here overall, except here, it's not from infection. You're trying to like neutralize that target, that TNF alpha, that upregulated part of the inflammatory response, TNF alpha. But since this is a protein, and tumor necrosis factor alpha, that is also a protein. And I've covered proteins before. Actually, I think I literally covered it last stream. But proteins can bind other proteins. And protein-protein interactions are integral part of like virtually every biological process. So like with that in mind, how does that relate to antibodies and like waning immunity or not? So just as the mRNA vaccine, the COVID mRNA vaccine, it confers some protection, maybe not full immunity, but some protection against future infection. But that protection wanes over time. You can also mount an immune response to this, to the actual drug that's being administered, because that is a protein in and of itself, and it's a foreign protein in and of itself. And that's why you have research like this, because now that you have the ever-increasing presence of these biological therapies like Humira, other ones, I'm sure if we go down the list, you're going to encounter other biologics. This is the other vaccine. Not that. Yeah, Stelara. That is also a protein-based, antibody-based therapy. No surprise. So yeah, monoclonal antibody, Stelara. You have adalimumab, Humira, also monoclonal. So like I said, you have the ever-increasing presence of these, biological therapies. And so, since these are protein-based, and, the spike protein is a protein, and so your body can generate antibodies against the spike protein. Well, your body can generate antibodies against other antibodies. And pretty much, it's a tricky situation. And this is kind of like an ever-increasing known thing, where the very therapies that we are trying to use to control some of these conditions, like your body is mounting an immune response to these therapies. And that's why you have anti-drug antibodies, where you have the therapeutic antibodies, like the Humiras, like the Stelara. But since these are foreign proteins, these are engineered proteins, they're not native to the human body. And so your body will recognize them as foreign, and you are now generating antibodies against, these foreign antibodies. So Crohn's disease is an autoimmune disease, which is like an allergic reaction in your gut for which so the short answer is like for traditional purposes, or like conventionally, Crohn's disease is thought of as an autoimmune disease, but I would make the case that classification is changing, and that it's actually more of an immune deficiency condition, where you can bring it up. I not have search? I could have sworn I had this search. I have to dig it up later. But I would say, yeah, the classification of Crohn's disease as an autoimmune condition is changing. And I would say it's more thought of now, at least in the most up-to-date research, as an immune deficiency. As in there are deficits in the immune system that appear to be playing a role in the condition. So your body can make antibodies to cancel out the antibodies it made. So that I would want to clarify. So that is probably not occurring. I just want to, what's occurring here is that with these pharmaceutical drugs, like the Humira, like the Stelara, these are foreign proteins. These are engineered outside of the body, and so your body will make antibodies against those, those pharmaceutical therapies like Humira and Stelara. But when it comes to like the spike protein and the immune response for that is actually probably, I don't know for sure because I haven't looked into it. That is probably not occurring because those antibodies are coming like from yourself. Where I don't know for sure, but you are probably not generating antibodies against the antibodies that you have against the spike protein. But that is, I guess it's technically possible, but highly unlikely because it's the spike protein that is generating the immune response. The analogy is like, basically, if you're injected with the mRNA, or you're injected with you're injected with the instructions to make a foreign protein. Then you make the foreign protein, and then your body mounts an immune response for the generation of antibodies. As opposed to in the pharmaceutical, it's not coming in the form of an mRNA, but it is still coming in the form of a foreign protein, as in the Stelara and the Humira. They are foreign proteins. Patients inject them, and therefore you mount an immune response to that foreign protein. So it's like basically just like, if your body is introduced to a foreign protein, as in not coming from yourself, not made by your own body, then there's a likelihood that your immune system will recognize it and will want to basically get rid of it or make antibodies against it. And that is actually one of the special things about actually one of the special things about Humira. Okay? One of the reasons why it's called Humira is because this is a second generation pharmaceutical, where it's what they called humanized, hence the name Humira, where they're basically trying to mask the fact that it's a foreign protein, as in like, hey, let's try to humanize the antibody so that hopefully there's less likelihood that your body will recognize it as foreign. Where it's in, should be in the marketing or in the description. Yeah, adalimumab was the first fully human monoclonal antibody. This is essentially like a second generation. And that's why they called it Humira, as they say here in the description. Human monoclonal antibody in rheumatoid arthritis, originally sort of targeted towards rheumatoid arthritis, and another, let's say, actual autoimmune condition. There's this there's the first generation of, let's say, this version of the drug called infliximab. That's also an antibody, but contrasting here in the table, so you have source. It says human. So again, they're trying to mask the fact that it's a foreign protein, trying to humanize it, without getting into the specifics of like how to humanize a protein. So like this was second generation, but the first generation, okay, comparing it to this table, so virtually the exact same applications, the exact same target. The mechanism of action is the exact same. So target here for infliximab, also known as Remicade, targeting tumor necrosis factors, TNF, what's the same as the adalimumab, the Humira. The difference is, okay, what makes it different is that it's chimeric. The source, it's both mouse and human, not fully humanized. And actually, when it comes to this drug, it's also a drug that I've been on way in the past. If you actually had a mouse allergy, you couldn't take it, or like you had to be kind of like pre-medicated with like Benadryl so that you wouldn't mount like an allergic reaction to this drug. So like this was like the first generation. So it's like, yeah, it's still an antibody, still a monoclonal antibody against the same target. The difference is that it's like a hybrid. It's like they took some pieces of, mouse stuff, and they took some pieces of human stuff, they put together, and, you get this hybrid antibody. That's why they call it chimeric. So that was like the first generation. And then this one came along, and this was, a pretty big step at the time, because like this proved to be like very effective. Okay. The challenge was, okay, not curative, and like it definitely it was not effective for every single patient that took it. But totally, in comparison to the traditional therapies at the time, this was like pretty groundbreaking, or like a huge step in the evolution of treatment for a variety of conditions. But the issue is that given the fact that, as they say, it's chimeric, there was this great likelihood that pretty much your body would recognize it, that, hey, this is a mouse protein. We're going to generate antibodies against this foreign antibody. And so patients would become immune to this drug. And that is literally what happened to me. As in, like, I was like one of the first actual patients on this drug at the time. And it's like, yeah, it just stops working. Like, it worked for a time, super effective, but for many patients, the effectiveness wears off, because like your body is saying, hey, this is part mouse protein, I'm going to generate antibodies against this, and so your body will neutralize therapy. And like I said, this was another big step, where it's like, it's pretty much the overall same mechanism of action. It's pretty much for the exact same conditions, binding to the same thing, that tumor necrosis factor alpha. But the novel, revolutionary step is like, oh, okay, this is no longer, some hybrid human and mouse antibody. This is fully human. Where it's like, okay, instead of like a half mask, disguising the drug, but let's put on the full, human mask, and hopefully we can bypass any sort of immune response. And it's a little bit paradoxical, at least in my mind, where it's like, for many of these conditions, as listed here, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis, and whatever conventionally or for simplicity's sake, Crohn's. These are all autoimmune conditions, and you know we're trying to treat these autoimmune conditions, but it's literally the immune system that is like posing a challenge, where it's like you know, as part of these conditions, the immune system is, you know, attacking something in your body, and then we're like trying to administer this pharmaceutical, and the immune system, you know, attacks the pharmaceutical, right? It's a pretty, at least in my mind, a strange scenario. And yeah, that is exactly pretty much the immune response. The proteins being fought makes the intended effects of the protein-based drug not as effective. Yes, the proteins being fought makes the intended effects of the protein-based drug not as... Yeah, exactly. As in your body can mount an immune response to these introduced proteins. And like, yeah, that is pretty much like the principle. As in, like, we want to disguise the fact as much as possible that we are administering these foreign proteins. Pretty much trying to put on the mask that, hey, you know, we're human, don't attack us, immune system. That's pretty much the overall thing that we're trying to do. And this has opened up kind of like a huge branch, I don't know, of medicine, well, whatever, a field of, you know, therapeutic drug monitoring, where it's like, okay, you know, we want to know, like, if a patient is becoming non-responsive to a medication, we want to know, is like, hey, is it for whatever reason, the medication is like no longer working, or is it, hey, your immune system is basically destroying the drug or neutralizing it, and that's why you have this kind of like this field of therapeutic drug and immunogenicity monitoring, because you want to be able to test, just as, you know, as I was sort of alluding to earlier. I want to be able to test, ideally, do I have the presence of anti-nucleocapsid antibodies in me, which would point to whether I've had a prior infection with COVID. As in, like, if I have the presence of anti-nucleocapsid antibodies circulating in me, then it's almost an absolute certainty that I have been infected with COVID at some point. And so we want to be able to answer the question of, like, hey, if we're giving this patient, you know, let's say, for example, Humira, Lara, or Remicade, we want to be able to answer the question of, like, hey, do these patients have antibodies against the antibodies that we're giving them? You know, pretty much like antibody-ception, so to speak. And there are multiple methods to do that. And one of them is called surface plasmon resonance, which is also area of a specialty of mine. But this is literally pretty much what they're overall doing in a clinical setting. So this has clinical implications, as in we want to be able to answer the question, you know, if a patient is, let's say, for example, receiving Humira, and this happened with myself. At one point, I was taking Humira, and for whatever reason, it stopped being effective for me. And so a doctor wants to be able to answer the question of, like, hey, are you now mounting an immune response to the medication? Or is it, for whatever reasons we don't know, your body has just, like, stopped responding to the drug? Because those have therapeutic applications. As in, like, it can guide treatment decisions. And as they sort of say here, towards the end, I guess it's a cost and lab availability issue, whether the blood test... Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally. These are literally, whatever, me as a patient. I've had to, like, confront some of these decisions. Exactly right, what to do next. Because like, very often, this is one of, like, the potential treatment strategies, of, like, hey, if you're able to measure the level of, let's see, appropriate terminology, anti-drug antibodies in the patient, as in, let's say, for myself, okay? You know, let's say I notice, which is what occurred to me, that, okay, the medication is losing its effectiveness. You know, my symptoms are increasing, or my disease is getting worse. And so, let's say now we test for the presence of anti-drug antibodies. And so, let's say, you know, the answer is yes. I do have anti-drug antibodies circulating in me, but they appear to be at a low level, as in not super high. Very often, a treatment strategy is just, like, increasing the dose. As in, like, oh, okay, like, yeah, you appear to be mounting an immune response to the medication, but it doesn't appear to be a strong immune response. So maybe we can overcome that by increasing the dose. And that does totally happen. Or, if you test for the presence of anti-drug antibodies, and it comes back that, oh, no, you don't have anti-drug antibodies, it's just, like, for whatever reasons that we don't understand, the medication has just, like, lost its effectiveness. Totally does happen. And we don't really understand why. Then it's like, okay, then we totally need to switch therapies. And let's see. Yeah, so more or less, like, summarized here of how it can guide treatment decisions. I should probably highlight. According to our therapeutic drug and immunogenicity monitoring analysis, 4 groups could be identified in the 15 patients. 8 patients were in remission and had, so IFX stands for infliximab levels. It's literally, they're testing this drug here for the presence of antibodies against this drug, infliximab, in the proposed therapeutic range, and no, can't remember what ATI stands for. Oh yeah, antibodies towards infliximab. Okay, they're just using a really weird way. So yeah, the presence of antibodies against the drug. Antibodies towards infliximab. So it's like, yeah, these patients, they had the drug present, and they did not have antibodies against the drug. 3 patients were in remission, although infliximab levels were below the cutoff, and anti-drug or antibodies against infliximab levels were measurable. These patients may thus benefit from stopping treatment to avoid potential toxic effects. 2 patients with active disease had antibodies towards infliximab and no measurable infliximab. Patients may benefit from switching to a different anti-TNF alpha antibody. And 2 patients have active disease despite adequate infliximab levels and no antibodies towards infliximab. These patients may benefit from switching to another class of agents. So it's like, yeah, they are pretty much, like, using the monitoring of anti-drug antibodies to guide treatment and patient. There's a whole bunch of research going. We have here on-site therapeutic drug monitoring. And you have immunogenicity assay development and validation for biological therapy, as exemplified by ustekinumab. That's that Stelara therapy. I mean, and one of the reasons why this is being developed, not only to hopefully make better decisions for patients. But also this appears to reduce costs. Although the data is a little bit mixed. Where you have articles like this: impact of therapeutic drug level monitoring on outcomes of patients with Crohn's disease treated with infliximab. Real world data from a retrospective single center cohort study. So it's not so cut and dry. But there appears to be some emerging evidence. There are not only benefits to patients, there are benefits in terms of like cost saving. So other stories cover this. Yes. This study, totally different lane, but actually before. One moment. Sadly enough, I have more scientific fraud. Courtesy of Bob Marley in the Discord. Oopsies. Sorry about that. Obviously. Don't know how to click. Okay. So before covering what I think is interesting of artificial intelligence and its intersection with, medicine. This last article, for now, I'm sure there's going to be more, about basically scientific fraud. More fake scientific papers are alarmingly common. And maybe on the topic of AI, maybe AI can address. So, and this appears to be based off of, not just an investigation, but like basically like an actual published report or scientific publication. Pretty much like doing the research about scientific fraud or fake scientific papers. Although it's currently published as a preprint, so it does not appear to be does not appear to have gone through peer review yet. So when neuropsychologist Bernard Sable put his new fake paper detector to work, he was shocked by what it found. After screening some 500 papers, he estimates up to 34% of neuroscience papers published in 2020 were likely made up or plagiarized. In medicine, the figure was 24%. Both numbers, which he and colleagues report in a medical archive preprint posted on the 8th of May, are well above levels they calculated for 2010, are larger than the 2% baseline estimated in a 2022 Publishers Group report. So it seems like maybe, okay, but this is just like one study that has not been peer-reviewed yet. Like one study is hinting at the fact that, hey, maybe scientific fraud has been underestimated, and maybe like massively so. It is just too hard to believe at first, says Sable of Otto von Guericke University, an editor-in-chief of Restorative Neurology and Neuroscience. It's as if somebody tells you 30% of what you eat is toxic. I recall hearing that most scientific findings are incorrect, so that's surprising, sadly. Yeah, absolutely. And I know... yeah. I know exactly talking about. That is not how you spell. So you're almost certainly referring to this, which totally, at the time, was, let's say, headline making. And I'm definitely not saying that this, is, let's say, false or bad, although this is like one paper from one researcher. And I would say, this person's reputation since the publication of this, they have essentially kind of like become like an anti-vaxxer, and kind of like even though they were highly respected and regarded at one point, I don't know that I would still, just my personal opinion, to say, I think there's been a little bit of a fall from grace, so to speak. No, not after, because this was published in like 2016 or something. Yeah, even before that, 2015, 2005, so like quite a while ago. But like, yeah, since the pandemic, let's just say, like, they have taken a little bit of a turn. This is not to say that they are not bringing up good things here, or that it invalidates everything that they have done. But I would just say, like, there's a little bit more of a grain of salt that I take this with has grown. Put it that way. There's much more of an asterisk. But I do have other articles, kind of going through, I mean, I try to highlight the issues that I see with science, where, peer review, where was it? Yes. Yeah, rescuing U.S. binomial research from its systemic flaws. So it's, I have other research to rely on, and other articles to rely on, kind of like showing the flaws with how we conduct science. So even if everything that Johnny Yanidis points out is false, there's other research to rely on. So, his findings underscore what was widely suspected. Journals are awash in a rising tide of scientific manuscripts from paper mills, secretive businesses that allow researchers to add their publication records by paying for fake papers or undeserved authorship. Paper mills have made a fortune by basically attacking a system that has had no idea how to cope with this stuff, says Dorothy Bishop, the University of Oxford psychologist who studies fraudulent publishing practices. A 2nd of May announcement from the publisher, Indawi, underlined the threat. It shut down 4 of its journals it found were heavily compromised by articles from paper mills. And yeah, this is also just like own thing in terms of paper. Sable's tool relies on just 2 indicators: authors who use private, non-institutional email addresses and those who list an affiliation with a hospital. It isn't a perfect solution because of a high false positive rate. Other developers of fake paper detectors, who often reveal little about how their tools work, contend with a similar issue. Like, that is definitely, I can wax poetic about how, capitalism and the profit motive really, basically, or like overall perverse incentives, pollute and corrupt science. And yeah, pay to publish, also like a known thing, and also like a pretty wide, well, I don't know about widespread, but a common practice, that, again, results in all kinds of like crazy stuff. Still, the detectors raise hopes for gaining the advantage over paper mills, which churn out bogus manuscripts containing text, data, and images partly or wholly plagiarized or fabricated, often massaged by ghostwriters. Some papers are endorsed by unrigorous reviewers solicited by the authors. Such manuscripts threaten to corrupt the scientific literature, misleading readers, and potentially distorting systematic reviews. The recent advent of artificial intelligence tools, such as ChatGPT, has amplified the concern. This is also a potential issue somewhere down the road, or even now. In terms of, I think even now, there are manuscripts and scientific publications that are using ChatGPT to either edit or write sections or contribute sections. And so it's do we want to filter that out, or how do we deal with a paper that has been entirely written by ChatGPT? We might get to a point of we upload data to ChatGPT or something, and you just get output of the summary of its findings with no human input. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I don't know. But I do know that there are scientific publications today that are in the authorship. They're putting ChatGPT or whatever AI in authorship. I have some examples of that. Yeah, and I'm not sure how to feel about these things or about these tools either. They're clearly powerful tools that they have a lot of potential to do a lot of great things. Also at the same time, do a lot of bad things. To fight back, the International Association of Scientific, Technical, and Medical Publishers, representing 120 publishers, is leading an effort called the Integrity Hub to develop new tools. STM is not revealing much about the detection methods to avoid tipping off paper mills. There's a bit more, there's a bit of an arms race, says Joris van Rossum, Integrity Hub's product director. He did say one reliable sign of a fake is referencing many retracted papers. Another involves manuscripts and reviews emailed from internet addresses crafted to look like those of legitimate institutions. Yeah, absolutely. The usual double-edged sword. With great power comes great responsibility. 20 publishers, including the largest, such as Elsevier, Springer Nature, and Wiley, are helping develop the Integrity Hub tools. And 10 of the publishers are expected to use a paper mill detector the group unveiled in April. STM also expects to pilot a separate tool this year that detects manuscripts simultaneously sent to more than one journal, a practice considered unethical and a sign they may have come from paper mills. Such large-scale cooperation is meant to improve on what publishers were doing individually and to share tools across the publishing industry, Van Rossum says. I'm not sure how... it's great that, these publishers, these large publishers that make crazy amounts of profits off of researchers and publications. It's great that they appear to be committed to basically trying to weed out some bad practices in science. But then at the same time, I don't know that I want these particular publishers to exist, personally. Yeah. I'm not in favor of upholding the current publishing model science. That includes publishers that, again, they take in huge amounts of profits off of largely unpaid labor. It will never be a fully automated process, it says. Rather, the tools are like a spam filter. You still want to go through your spam filter every week to check for erroneously flagged legitimate content. STM hasn't yet generated figures on accuracy or false positive rates because the project is too new. Catching as many fakes as possible typically produces more false positives. Stable's tool correctly flagged nearly 90% of fraudulent or retracted paper, Estes. However, it marked up to 44% of genuine papers as fake, so results still need to be confirmed by skilled reviewers. Other paper mill detectors typically have a similar trade-off, says Adam Day, founding director of a startup called Clear Skies, who consulted with STM on the Integrity Hub. But without some reliance on automated methods, you either have to spot check randomly, or you use your own human prejudice to choose what to check. That's not generally very fair. Right. So, moment. This kind of comes down to, or at least in my mind, is analogous to like content moderation on social media, where it's like, on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, a lot of content is moderated automatically or like through AI or some sort of algorithm, where it's just like it removes things, and obviously people know that the algorithm or AI that they're using can be exploited. It can make mistakes, but then at the same time, as much as people advocate for human-directed content moderation on these social media platforms, so as to prevent, or at least reduce some of the mistakes that an algorithm or an AI makes. Well, even on Twitch, a lot of I think some content on Twitch is auto-moderated. Maybe at some point it's human. But it just requires, it says on Twitter, there is so much content to moderate, and on Facebook, that, to have humans pretty much moderate all the content just is such a huge undertaking that it seems like it's virtually impossible. And it seems like sort of like the same challenge is here in scientific publication, is that there's just such a huge amount being published, and to have a human go through all of the publications to ensure that it's suitable for publication, not fraudulent. Not to mention, it requires a certain amount of expertise and training that I think the barrier is higher than in comparison to content moderation on Twitter or Facebook. To actually do appropriate vetting of a scientific publication, huge endeavor. And even though there's probably huge drawbacks, automation, it's almost like there's no choice, given just like the huge amount of stuff you have to go through. And they pretty much say it here. Scrutinizing suspect papers can be time-consuming. In 2021, Springer Nature's post-publication review of about 3,000 papers suspected of coming from paper mills required up to 10 part and full-time staffers, said Chris Graff, the company's director of research integrity, at a U.S. House of Representatives subcommittee hearing about paper mills in July 2022. Springer Nature publishes about 400,000 papers annually. So it's like, there's like 100 times these many papers, over 100 times as many papers published. And so you probably need to have at least 100 times the human power that they use here. Just go over these 3,000 papers. Newly updated guidelines for journals issued in April may help ease the workload. They may decide to reject or retract batches of papers suspected of having been produced by a paper mill, even if the evidence is circumstantial, says the Nonprofit Committee on Publication Ethics, which is funded by publishers. Its previous guidelines encourage journals to ask authors of each suspicious paper for more information, which can trigger a lengthy back and forth. Some outsiders wonder whether journals will make good on promises to crack down. Publishers embracing gold open access, under which journals collect a fee from authors to make their papers immediately free to read when published, have a financial incentive to publish more, not fewer papers. They have a huge conflict of interest regarding paper mills, says Jennifer Byrne of the University of Sydney, who has studied how paper mills have doctored cancer genetics Like, yeah, I don't think... Sure, but I'm pretty suspect. If, like, one of the proposed solutions, is, you know, sort of, pay barrier. The publish or perish, pressure that institutions put on scientists is also an obstacle. We want to think about engaging with institutions on how to take away perhaps some of the professional incentives which can have these detrimental effects, Van Rossum says. Such pressures can push clinicians without research experience to turn to paper mills, Abel adds, which is why hospital affiliations can be a red flag. Where it's like, you know, I would say this is a major contributing factor, where, you know, in the research world, the scientific research, medical research, a lot of your career, if not the majority of your career, is based off of your ability to publish or the number of publications you have. And if there is an easy way to, you know, pad your publication resume or CV, you know, no surprise that there's going to be people out there that will take advantage of that. Publishers should also welcome help from outsiders to improve the technology supporting paper mill detectors, although this will require transparency about how they work. Byrne says, when tools are developed behind closed doors, no one can criticize or investigate how they perform, she says. A more public, broad collaboration would likely strengthen them faster than paper mills could keep up, she adds. Day sees some hope. Flagging journals suspected of being targeted by paper mills can quickly deter additional fraudulent submissions. He points to his analysis of journals that the Chinese Academy of Sciences put on a public list because of suspicions aimed paper mills. His company's paper mill alarm detector showed that before the Chinese Academy of Sciences list came out, suspicious papers made up the majority of some journals' content. Afterward, the proportion dropped to nearly zero within months. Paper mill alarm flags potentially fraudulent papers based on telltale patterns revealed when a paper mill repeatedly submits papers. The company does not publicly disclose what the signs are. Journals could drive a similar crash by using automated detectors to flag suspicious manuscripts, nudging paper mills to take them elsewhere. Some observers worry paper mill paper will merely migrate to lower impact journals, fewer resources to detect them, but if many journals act collectively, the viability of the entire paper mill industry could shrink. It's not necessary to catch every fake paper, Day says. It's about having practices which are resistant to their business model. So the paper mill, flagged as highly suspicious. Tracking it by year, number of papers. After a 2020 report named journals suspected of containing paper mill papers, an analysis using the paper mill alarm automated detector found that the number of such papers in one of those journals, which the analysis did not name, declined quickly and sharply. Columns show the number of papers by month. Not flagged as okay, so pretty much like showing the nosedive after 2020. Yeah, after a 2020 report. So, seems like exposing it had some measurable effect, which is a good thing. But I'm curious how this tracks, you know, over the next subsequent year. I suspect that it's going to be kind of like playing whack-a-mole to a certain extent. So that's all the kind of like fake or fraudulent research that I wanted to go over, or the articles about fraudulent research. Do I want to cover this now? I'm gonna save this. I've been streaming for a little over 3.5 hours. I think we're gonna end the stream here for now. Yeah. I'm gonna end the stream here for now. Also getting pretty hungry. So with that, I want to thank everyone that passed by, and also everyone that had the patience to put up with the technical difficulties that I had with the stream. Apologies for my internet cutting out multiple times during like the first hour. Thank you, Tyler, for the raid. Much appreciated. shout out to them. And thank you for the follow, The Angel Demon. Thank you, Towelette, for the follow. Buffy Geek, much appreciated. Anybody else that I forgot, I apologize. Thank you, Discount Seth Rogen, Bob Marley, Smash, for passing by. And anybody else that I forgot, apologies. I plan to stream next tomorrow, because I do want to cover this. Oopsies. And there's a whole bunch of other content that I want to cover about, microbiome, etc. Always in excess of scientific. So I do plan to stream tomorrow. It should be around the same time, but I'll update the Discord on exactly when I plan to stream tomorrow. Feel free to join the Discord. There's a lot of great resources there, and I do my best to keep updated on when I'm streaming. Schedule's a little bit all over the place currently, but I do plan to stream either tomorrow afternoon or like late afternoon. And thank you so much for the kind words and also the great questions from everybody. So yeah, gonna end it there. Super grateful. And until next time, take care, be well, and be kind.